So how we're gonna go about this, everyone, is that I've got a couple questions, but this is just like we do a lot of the AMAs. I'm really looking for people with your own questions. Just raise your hand. I'll be watching, and Marley, if you could kind of help me watch too for people who have raised their hands and help people get up on stage that want to ask some questions, that'd be super helpful.
Of course, I can do that for you. Yeah, I'll watch.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think this is usually the way it goes. People start trickling in, but I think that we should get going. So thanks everybody for coming and joining us this morning. I'm super excited about this conversation. I got connected to Brian from a mutual friend, someone who used to work at Holacracy One with Brian, and yeah, he's one of the, I guess I'm going to let you tell more of the story because you certainly know it more, but I think you're the inventor of Holacracy. Is that correct, Brian?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, a lot of people were involved, but I'm kind of the main pioneer behind it.
So, yeah, I'm just really excited to learn about more about Holacracy and how that can help us guide. I know that Brian, in a minute, I'm just going to have you tell a little bit of your story, and if you could kind of mix in Holacracy and crypto, because I know you're a big crypto advocate as well. So I think it's just going to be super interesting to hear about Holacracy and how it can help the new self-governing DAO movement, which of course we are now a part of. So yeah, please, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've been involved in the crypto space for quite a while now. 2013 was my first investment in crypto, and as soon as I heard about Bitcoin, I took a deep dive, and it just ticked every box of what I was looking for in the world. And then Ethereum, I was in the Ethereum ICO, which was probably the most successful investment I think I'll ever make in my life. But
Probably so, yeah.
yeah, but as soon as I read about it, it was just an instant yes, like this is next. This has got to work. And I think the reason that crypto just spoke to me so clearly is I've been in the space of looking for more decentralized ways of organizing and coordinating from before that, thanks to my work with Holacracy, which goes back to pretty much the early 2000s. When I was the founder and CEO of a software company. It was my first major startup at that point. And I turned my company into a laboratory. I was looking for new ways to manage, new ways to build and lead an organization. And I'd been in, traditional companies before, and they just left me feeling like there's got to be a better way to do this, right? This is nuts. The waste, my background's in software development, software architecture and design, and if we look at the design of most traditional companies, it's just not elegant. It's pretty crazy, and there's just got to be a better way. So I used my software company to experiment, and over years we would just experiment with any idea, technique, practice, process, method, anything we could find to maybe find better ways to structure and break down work, to coordinate and organize effort. And what I was really looking for was something more decentralized, something that allowed more people to have real voice, real power, to be able to drive change. And over years of experimentation, we eventually developed the method that's the framework that's now called Holacracy, which you can think of as a decentralized management framework. It's or another way of saying it is management without managers. It replaces what we currently know as a top-down management hierarchy, a command hierarchy. It's a different framework for breaking down work, coordinating, and organizing in a company than what we're used to.
So, sorry, were you still? I certainly want to hear more about that. I wasn't sure if I needed to ask for more, if there was just a natural pause there.
I was a natural pause to make sure you had space to jump in if you wanted to steer the conversation. I'm happy to keep talking, but
tell us more about what did you management without managers, right? Is that what you just said?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an organizing framework, right? So management, we often I think well, maybe not we in the in the space that's interested in DAOs, but in most of the business world, people tend to think of management hierarchy as the only way to do it, right? Like you've got to break down work, you've got to figure out who's doing what, you've got to have some way of organizing, coordinating, and aligning effort and making sure there's accountability. And I think people just tend to assume that a command hierarchy of managers who can boss around subordinates is really the only way to break down work and organize. And I think that's, of course, not true at all. There are lots of other ways you could do it. Some might work not as well, but perhaps some could work better. And Holacracy is a different organizing framework or a different operating system, if you will. Instead of vesting power in a CEO at the top of a hierarchy, and then that CEO breaking down, down a hierarchy, who's got which area, who's got which power, and so on. Holacracy uses a different method to get there. It's basically a role-based system, so it's focused on defining roles. What are the roles we need to get the purpose met of this organization? So my company, for example, we do a lot of training, we do a lot of consulting, and we have a software product that helps companies run with Holacracy. So we break down into those kind of three areas. We have some others too, but those, and then we break down roles. We have a trainer role, we have a training design role, we have a role that figures out where we're going to schedule our trainings, or lately online. And so Holacracy is a framework for defining these roles, but instead of just a manager deciding what the roles are, which frankly most managers don't do that well, they just tend to micromanage instead of create clarity. Instead, Holacracy has a governance process where anyone on a team is invited to propose changes to the role structure of the team. And then there's a way to get nested teams and what we call a holarchy in there. But to at least start touching it a little bit more concretely, every team in an organization has a governance process doing the work that we typically think of as going to a manager, of breaking down who does what are the roles, who's accountable for what, and what decision-making rights or authority does each role have, right? And there's a couple things that I think are worth highlighting to this group in particular here. I wrote a blog post on this a while back, a couple years ago now. When I look at the crypto world, there's something that I find frustrating and sad, which is there's all these people in this space that really get the value of decentralized order, right? That get that you can have order without top-down command, right? And yet, when you look at the way most crypto companies are organized internally, they're command hierarchies. It's there's something kind of ironic about that, I think, right? Like a whole community of people that really get the value of decentralized, spontaneous order and approaches, and yet we organize companies in this way that is more akin to a feudal system. And yet, I understand why, because we need results. And when you look at what's currently in the broader cultural awareness of the alternative, it's actually not that attractive, which is an entirely pure market system. And there's some crypto companies doing this where they're trying to go 100% pure DAO or just total decentralized, where every actor is representing their own interests, and you try to design the incentive system such that efforts are aligned. And that's actually ridiculously hard to do. I'm not saying it's impossible, and if you can get it right, damn, that's cool. But it's hard. It's really, really hard to create an incentive system that doesn't have unintended consequences, right? It's certainly possible, and I think we've seen plenty of examples of that, but the more complex it gets, the harder it gets, right? I mean, even take Bitcoin, which I think does that well, but it's a relatively simple system. It gets harder and harder as you start layering on organizational functions. So I think there's a false dichotomy here. Those are not your only two choices. You don't have to either go completely top-down command hierarchy or say, forget having even what looks like a single organization, and let's have a complete networked architecture to get everything done where everyone involved is an individual actor representing their own interests. And I think what Holacracy does that's something of a hybrid or a blend there, every actor showing up in a company running with Holacracy there's a layer of indirection. They're representing their roles, not themselves personally. So, for example, my company, which obviously runs with Holacracy, we have a bunch of people involved doing work, but they're not representing purely their own interests. When they sign up to be part of the company, they're signing up to basically be a fiduciary or a steward of the organization's roles. And then when they fill a role, they have decentralized power. Every role has real command authority, decision-making rights. So every role has power. There's no hierarchy. There's no bosses and subordinates. But the person filling a role has given a commitment, a contractual commitment in this case, to represent the interests of that role as best they can. So you end up with something that still behaves like a single organization where everyone in it is pulling for the purpose of the organization first, very intentionally. And yet the way of organizing that single entity internally is a distributed system. And so let me use one metaphor and then I'll shut up for questions. My favorite example of an organization is the human body, right? We have trillions of cells all working together, and yet there's no CEO cell telling the others what to do, right? There's no top-down command hierarchy of cells bossing around other cells. And yet there is this beautiful coordination, but nor do we have every cell purely pulling for itself, right? When one cell decides to ignore the broader environment and do its own thing, we call that cancer, and it tends to be destructive for the broader system. So we have this interesting way where every cell has autonomy, and yet it's part of a larger entity, right? Cells group together into organs, and the heart's job is not to boss around the heart cells. It's to take the different functions, the roles, the muscle cells and blood cells and nerve cells and whatever, and integrate them into a larger whole function, and one that doesn't poke in and micromanage and violate their autonomy, but builds on top of it. It layers a function on top of it, which itself is just a part of a cardiovascular system, which is yet a larger function, right? And when you look at a system like that, nature's way of organizing, you have something it's fascinating in that it's not a pure network with no integrating structure. There is a hierarchy there, but it's not a command hierarchy of cells bossing around other cells, right? It's what's often referred to as a holarchy. It's a hierarchy. I think of it as a definitional or a boundary defining hierarchy, right? So this is what Holacracy uses. We have broader circles in Holacracy that can integrate subcircles, but they can't tell them what to do. They define the boundaries. They define what's in scope or out of scope of one of their sub-entities. And so anyway, I know I've thrown a whole lot of information out there. So
yeah. So I have a couple questions to try to tease some of that apart, and thank you for that. So like you talk about the boundaries, right? And what's in scope, what's out of scope. And then is that what's in the proposal that is then voted on by the entire organization to make sure that some new functional unit that's being defined is then agreed upon by everybody? Is that how that works?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. One, it's in terms of what goes into a proposal, the proposals are not specific actions to take. They're structural proposals, or what we call governance. So you wouldn't ever see us making a decision, for example, like where do we open our next training? Should we do it in China or India or wherever else? We don't do that in a group process. That goes to one person who fills a role, who is empowered to make that decision. What we do in the governance process is define the boundaries of that role, right? Which role decides that, and what are the restrictions on that decision-making right? So, so the first part of your question is a yes. What goes into that proposal is about the boundaries of what's in scope or out of scope, the constraints, the structure, the expectations that go with the power, right? So for example, the role that for us chooses the venue, what hotel do we do the training in or whatever, has a requirement that goes with that to make sure whatever venue they choose integrates the need list from the trainer, right? So we start defining the connection points between the entities in that process without making the specific decision of which hotel to use. Now, the things I'll change in what you said that are off, it's not going to the whole company. Okay. In this case, we have a training circle in my company, and in that circle is any role involved with doing training. And the proposal there is going to the training circle And anyone filling a role in that circle has a right to be involved in that governance process. The people who are not filling a role in that circle don't have a right to be involved in that governance process, right? So, for example, I fill our trainer role at some of our trainings, so I would have a voice in that governance, but our marketing person who doesn't actually fill any roles in our training circle wouldn't have a voice in that proposal. They would in anything that touches the marketing circle, but not in the training circle.
Right. So
and the other change to what you said, vote is not quite the right word, right? Vote implies, one, that there's some majority. I think as soon as you're using something where majority rules, you have a fundamental design flaw in your system, right? Often the majority doesn't know best. It's the minority that has some key information that needs to get integrated. At the same time, I think going with, consensus of everyone is also a horrible, horrible design choice for most systems. As soon as you ask everyone to agree on anything, everything stalls, everything stops. So Holacracy is a very different decision-making threshold required for these governance proposals. And the two distinctions I'd make are, one, we're not asking anyone personally. We're only asking on behalf of the roles you fill in the circle. So in other words, somebody can't just say, no, I don't like it, right? If they want to add something that has to get solved before the proposal passes, it has to be relevant to the purpose of their work in that circle. They can't just say, no, I don't think it's the best idea. They have to say, here's why your proposal is going to get in the way of doing my role. That's how you add it. And that's the other key distinction I make. It's not just a block. It's no, here's a specific reason why the proposal is going to get in the way of me doing my work. And that has to get solved before the proposal goes forward. So it's not about stopping it or voting it in or out. It's about adding criteria that we have to solve so that we don't cause harm in another part of the system while we solve somebody's tension somewhere in the team.
So basically that's like you just voice if it somehow blocks you or there's some kind of block to it, you propose that. But if there is no block, if for you fulfilling your role, then you don't have to affirmatively agree to it. You just don't have a problem with it. What
we're looking for is not agreement. We're looking for, does anyone have an objection? And an objection has a very specific definition. Holacracy is a constitutional power structure. So there's a constitution. It's a legal, you can literally legally adopt this. It's a legally clear document. And it defines objection very specifically. It's not just you don't like it or you don't want it. It's you see a specific reason why it gets in the way of your role getting its work done. So we're looking for objection or no objection from everyone. We're not looking for agreement. We're not looking for buy-in. We're just looking for, do you see any reasons why this is getting in the way of you doing your work? And if you do, then you have a requirement to provide that reason, and it has to meet certain test conditions. Right. So, and this is pretty cool. The test conditions there stop everyone from just piling on to try to get everything done in one proposal. Right. It makes sure that, look, you might have something else we need to address, but you should use your own proposal to do that, unless the proposal on the table now is actually making your thing worse, right? Is actually getting in your way. If it just fails to solve your favorite issue, bring your own damn proposal. Right. So, and it's almost like a Socratic questioning process. There's 4 different questions that are asked when somebody raises an objection. And the questions make sure that the objection is really something we need to deal with now before this proposal can be adopted. And that really cuts down on the amount of discussion and other stuff you need to do before you can get this proposal passed and at least solve somebody's issues so they can move forward with their work better.
You said there's 4 questions?
4 questions, yeah. You'll find them in the Holacracy Constitution, and we also have some resources on our website where you can just get little process cards and things like that.
Yeah. Got it. That's interesting. So, how I can relate that some, part of this discussion is like, how can this inform DAOs and the governance mechanisms of DAOs? And one of the things that I see a clear difference between right now is the proposals that I hear you talking about in holacratic. That's the right word, right? Holacratic organization.
Say Holacracy powered, but yeah.
Holacracy power. Okay, Holacracy powered organization are about they're not exactly action decisions. They're more governance, they're structure, they're boundary creating. Whereas a lot of our proposals, there's a mix. Some of them, like for example, I had a proposal to create the engineering workstream that did kind of define the structure and what are the goals and kind of measurement criteria of that. But there's a lot of proposals that are very budget focused, right? That are actually to spend money to do this. And then also our voting is more, right? It's one each Fox token you hold basically gives you one vote power, so to speak, and you are voting yes or no, and there's rules about a quorum and that kind of stuff. So how do you manage how money is spent in a holacracy powered organization?
The first thing I'd say is think of holacracy as a meta framework. So it's because it's just looking at the broader governance boundaries of who has what power and what restrictions. You can then within that define any specific processes you want. So including, you might for certain specific decisions define that these 4 roles all need to be involved or all need to say yes to something or whatever. So you can define any specific structures you want. But your default in holacracy is if you fill a role and your role wants to make a decision for its purpose, you have the full power to go ahead and do it unless there's a rule against it. So in most companies, you have to get permission to act, either from the boss or sometimes through some kind of vote or consensus process. With holacracy, it's the opposite. You don't need to get permission to act. You already have the full authority to make any decision in the organization to get your role's purpose done, unless there's a rule against it. And then we use the meta framework of holacracy to start putting in the boundaries and defining the rules against it, right? What constraints do we want? And through that, we can define any set of constraints you want. So however you want to do budgeting is possible to define. In fact, you could even perfectly recreate a top-down management hierarchy within the holacracy meta framework if you really wanted to. Right? Or you could perfectly create a system where every decision has to be voted on by everybody or by token holders or anything else you want. It's a meta framework for defining and shaping the rules of the game in a company. So you can really define anything. Now, there's defaults for some things like spending money. There's a default in the holacracy constitution for, but then you can adjust that as you want. In my company, for example, anyone can spend money, but they have to first publicly post in our Slack channel that they intend to spend a certain amount of money on a certain purpose. And then others can ask questions that they have to answer. And if somebody thinks it's bad spend, there's a process to escalate that to a more thorough consideration process that involves a role that about 5 people fill that can jump in and basically vote on the spend. But that's just our company's approach, right? Like every company is going to have a different way of doing it. Same thing, hiring and firing, or adding somebody to the payroll or whatever. There's no one answer for that in holacracy. It's a meta framework. We've defined our own answer in my company. Any other company might do it differently. But the beauty is with the meta framework, you can evolve your answers. So I can tell you, I love how my company fires people. And I don't know many companies that can genuinely say they love how they fire people. And the reason I think our process is so damn effective is because it's evolved for 7 years, where every time we fired somebody and it didn't work that great, somebody brought a proposal to our governance process to change the firing rules. Right? So we're constantly evolving the design of our system. And 7 years of evolution later, we have a firing process where we've literally fired people and had them turn around and become our customers or thank us for it. One guy I was involved in firing just spent Christmas at my house, right? Like our firing process works. It's human, it's respectful, it's effective. But that's not because we're brilliant designers. That's because we had a really shitty firing process 7 years ago. And somebody proposed a change and improved it. And then again and again and again. And I think that's what we really need to see. It's that evolutionary system. If we want to have companies that are really fit for their environment, right? We need evolution to design them instead of brilliant, intelligent design top down.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things I'm thinking of as you've been speaking there is, so we have, and I'll tie it into what you said in just a minute. We have this idea of work streams, right? So there's an engineering work stream, there's an operations work stream, and each of these work streams were formed through a proposal that was created to define the functions. I don't know how much, I guess there was some boundary stuff in there. It wasn't, this is maybe something for me to learn as thinking about going forward. There wasn't a ton of clarity about how one work stream would interact with another work stream. A lot of us, most of us have come from the centralized, the ShapeShift Inc., where a lot of that stuff is kind of already implicit in the way we operate. So I think maybe we weren't so clear on defining some of that stuff, which again, maybe that will change over time and we'll get that more and more codified on some of that stuff. But those work streams do have a lot of autonomy, right? They have a budget and there is autonomy within that work stream to spend that budget any way they want. And if somebody wants to make basically a request for funds to pay themselves or to do something with it, it is one of those mechanisms where they make the request, and if nobody objects within 72 hours, the request is fulfilled.
Yeah.
If someone objects, then it goes into a voting process that is then based, kind of like how you talked about, you only can vote if you are in the circle. For a work stream funding request to be able to have a say, to be able to object to that or vote to approve it or not, you have to have reputation in that work stream. You have to have done work in that work stream already. Yeah. So seeing some similarities coming across there, and thinking that, all this, it seems like the whole Holacracy could even be experimented in just a work stream, right? It's not even like a whole DAO thing. And I think I read that in some of your teachings, is that you can do this small. You don't have to bring this into an entire organization all at once. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there are two ways to bring it in small. One, you can bring it into part of an organization, or in your case, to one work stream. Anytime there is work to organize for a purpose, you need to break down who's doing what are the boundaries, who makes which decisions, what are the constraints. Holacracy can do that. It can do it in a single team or a single work stream or a whole company. The other way is the Holacracy Constitution, which the rules of the game, is intentionally modular. There's 5 major components or sections of it, articles. And you can adopt one at a time, and each one is for a specific kind of general purpose. And then you can kind of add out one at a time chunks of rules, right? So you can kind of adopt it modularly and build it that way. And then finally, and this is now into the realm of definitely experimental stuff. Everything I've been talking about up until now, there's lots of companies doing. In fact, thousands now running with Holacracy all over the world. But where the edge that we're experimenting that might be relevant for you guys especially is now mixing a tokenized DAO framework with an organization organized with Holacracy, acting as kind of one entity but with a decentralized structure internally. So for example, we're doing this in my company right now. We have one of our business lines is licensing. So we take the Holacracy, there's a trademark, there's a bunch of materials we've created, and we license other professional service firms, consulting firms who want to bring this to their geography or market or whatever. Up until now, that licensing program has been very traditional. There's a license agreement, they sign with us. But what we really want to do is kind of move the brand ownership of Holacracy into something that's more decentralized. So what we're doing is tokenizing our licensing program, where we're creating a foundation. We're going to put ownership of the materials we license, the trademark rights into this foundation. And we're creating a token. And then the foundation itself has organizational functions that we need to do. There's quality control. That's the main point of our licensing, quality control. So certifications and assessments. We want to make sure anyone that sells themselves as a Holacracy consultant actually knows what the hell they're doing. So that's one of the main functions of this. The other function of the foundation is outreach, just helping spread the word and help people understand what Holacracy is, create free materials, things like that. But the idea is, with this tokenized system, there's a whole economic model behind it, which I won't get into now, but there'll be certain proposals that do need to go out to the token holders to ratify or approve, right? So For example, anytime there's a new quality standard that we want to put into our licensing system, that'll need to go to a vote of the token holders. But the actual work of organizing, designing assessments and running a certification program and running the assessments, that'll be organized through Holacracy by this organization, this foundation. So it's kind of this interesting hybrid of we've got a tokenized ecosystem, and in that sense, a tokenized economic model, a decentralized kind of brand ownership. Every licensee of Holacracy will have some tokens and will have a stake in this ecosystem and the licensing program. And a vote in certain proposals like quality standards that they're held to and other things like that. But the work of organizing this stuff, which is still needed, that's where I think trying to organize that in a purely decentralized way has lots of problems. So in that case, it will still be organized in a decentralized way internally to this organization. The foundation will run with Holacracy. There is no top-down management hierarchy involved. And yet it can still act as a single organization. The workers are there to fill roles for the sake of the purpose of this thing, and there's a governance process to organize that work. So we're now blending the idea of a DAO with the idea of an organizational entity, right? It's just we've organized that organization, not with a traditional command hierarchy.
Yeah, interesting. That's going to be interesting to follow that for sure. I still have questions, but I want to reiterate because a lot of people have joined since we started. Please, if you have questions, raise your hand or just come up on stage if you have that power and throw your questions out. This is definitely meant to be something for the community here to ask questions about.
I thought the ESOP question was really interesting, like an employee stock ownership agreement. It seems like Holacracy, excuse me, I'm bad at phonics, is quite aligned with something like an ESOP where you have shared ownership in that, like that just like kind of drives the point home that you want to make, like, okay, yes, I'm making decisions, but it should be for the good of the company as a whole, because like, oh, I'm an owner of the company. Can you elaborate on that? That was asked by, I think, Ron.
Yeah, I saw that, Ron. Thanks for the question. I love it. I've actually talked with many people in traditionally managed ESOPs who are a little disillusioned and will express to me something like, when our company went to an ESOP, we were at first all excited. This would be more, communally governed, whatever. But it doesn't actually change anything in the way you run the company, right? Like sure, everyone has some now financial economic stake in it, but the management structure doesn't change when you change the ownership structure underneath of it. So there's a bit of a disconnect there often, where I think Holacracy really takes the ideal of what companies are often trying to achieve with an ESOP and now operationalizes it day to day, where sure, you can have the shared ownership of an ESOP, but now with Holacracy, you can actually invite everyone to be part of the work of managing the entity, right? Everyone now gets invited into this governance process. Everyone has real authority distributed to them. So it's really taking the idea of an ESOP, but actually putting it into practice in the day-to-day management of the entity. So the two are highly complementary. They go together really well. And yet they also address different things. Holacracy does not address the ownership structure. It addresses the operational governance structure, how we organize and get work done, right? You can do that and still have the entire entity owned financially by one person. That's perfectly compatible. You can still have everyone involved in the governance, or vice versa. You can have a total ESOP and you can have, or co-op even, and you can have, a command hierarchy in how you run it. So these are two different areas. Holacracy addresses one, and it's highly compatible with more democratized or decentralized approaches for ownership as well. And I want to answer Ron's follow-up question too. How difficult is it for organizations that aren't created in this structure, Holacracy, to move to it? Difficult, but not impossible. Most of the thousands of organizations out there were not startups that started from Holacracy in the beginning. They were traditional companies that switched over to Holacracy. So it's certainly possible. It's the main use case right now, but it's difficult. This is a pretty radical paradigm shift, right? You're changing the way power works, and that's not something that just happens overnight. When I was working with, I don't know if you guys know David Allen's work, Getting Things Done, or GTD. He's an author of the GTD book and process. It's a personal productivity practice. He was one of the early adopters of Holacracy in his company almost 10 years ago now. And when I first met him, and he kind of learned a bit about Holacracy. He said his intuition was this is a 5-year journey. In fact, he wrote the foreword of my book, and he put that in there. His intuition was this was a 5-year journey, and I think that's part of the reason he was so successful with it. Is he didn't go in thinking this is a quick fix. This is something to do this month. He realized this was a radical change to everything about how people function and thought about organization. And that doesn't mean 5 years to get positive ROI, right? Like the ROI can come in a matter of months where it's at least more efficient than what you were doing. But to really embody the change is a multi-year journey. And 5 years in, he came back to me and said he was wrong. It's actually a 10-year journey. and I think that's a really good frame to go into it with. It's a major change. It's a long-term change. But if you go in with that attitude and you get some support, it doesn't have to be incredibly difficult. It's work. It's a change, right? But again, you can make it easier or harder on yourselves. I like to think of it like a practice, right? It's like learning to play a new sport, right? If you get a good coach, you practice over time. You don't have to, play World Cup level at the beginning. When you first learn to play soccer, it's 6-year-olds playing soccer on a field. They're still playing soccer. They're doing their best. And with enough practice, they get better and better until eventually maybe they're playing World Cup level, right? Holacracy is like that. Start where you are. Practice it as best you can, accept that it's going to look like a bunch of 6-year-olds on a soccer field at first, and keep practicing.
Hey, I've got a question. And Jack, I think I've invited you to speak. I think you're raising your hand. So you should be able to click a button down below to be able to come up on the stage if you were meaning to get up here. But my question, Brian, particularly interesting since you're from the software background. So before we had an engineering team of about 20, and I was the director of engineering. There are some engineering managers, and each of those engineering managers had a team of 3 to 5. And so work, went through the organization like that. The teams worked on things and the managers kind of directed and did one-on-ones. So now we're looking at an engineering work stream that's going to start with 13. And I'm talking to people. So I'm the work stream leader, and I'm trying not to be the director of engineering, but the vision I have is of an organizing principle. And then, but someone needs to present and has to, the way we've structured ourselves is these work stream leaders basically have a little bit more control over the budget. And then I'm talking to people, do we need engineering managers, right? And if you don't have engineering managers and there's 13 of us, is there so in a holacracy where people don't have managers, are people regularly having one-on-ones with other people in their circles to stay informed? Or how's the information shared if it's not coming down through a hierarchy, right? Which is a typical way for information to be shared in a hierarchical organization.
Yeah. Well, so one, I'd say the whole idea of one-on-ones, which are really popular, I look at it as kind of a hack, right? That it's what you do when you don't actually know what really should be communicated from what point to what point. And so, we're not sure. Let's just catch all with a one-on-one and then someone will figure it out, which actually is fine as a starting point. But what you really want to do is figure out who needs to communicate what to whom, right? And define your information pathways and flows. And you can't do that up front. You can do that over time. You can evolve that. And I think this is, to me, one of the fundamental shifts that Holacracy brings in. It doesn't try to get the design right up front. It doesn't try to answer that question you just asked all up front. What it does is say, well, start where you are, and then just notice where is there tension showing up in the system? Where are you not getting a communication that would be useful to you? And now go propose adding that specific communication pathway, right? So then over time, these pathways evolve, and you get clarity on exactly who needs to communicate what to whom. What goes to some public channel in Slack or whatever you use. What goes to another role filler, But this can actually evolve. So for example, let me just give a little, this is a true story anecdote of how this works, this evolution. From my company, many years ago, I fill a role in my company called spokesperson. And so I'm the one that often ends up doing things like this, sharing Holcracy with the world. And when we first created my role, we had a purpose for the role, and we had one responsibility, one expectation on the role. And now it's got many, they evolve over time. And these expectations start defining other communication pathways or other things that others need to count on me for. So here's where one of them came from. I was working with another role in my company called casting agent. And our casting agent has to book me for talks, right? I do a lot of public speaking at conferences and things like that. So we were getting a lot of invites to our casting agent, who sifts through them, and the casting agent would be building relationships with the conference organizers, negotiating, what kind of talk am I going to do? Where are we getting paid for it? What are the terms and all that? And what was actually happening many years back, the casting agent would do all that work, build a relationship, negotiate something, and present the opportunity to me. And I'd look at it and say, no, I'm not going to go to that one, right? It's not worth my time, or the market's not big enough, wrong audience, whatever. And she felt really disempowered. What a waste, right? Like somehow she's not getting the communication of what's valuable for me to go to early in her process. So she's wasting a ton of time. So what happens here? She goes to our governance meeting of this is our marketing circle, both our roles work in. She goes to the governance meeting of our marketing circle, and she proposes adding an expectation on my role. She says she wants to expect from me that I will document and publish the criteria I use for which speaking engagements to accept or reject. Right? This is one communication, right, that she needs from me. And I'll document it and publish it to her role, or where she can see it. And it took 2 minutes in our governance meeting to get that expectation added to my role. And then after the meeting, she came to me and said, okay, great. So give me an estimate. When do you think you're going to have that drafted for me by? We've now defined this new communication pathway. What I find so fascinating about this story, she was our newest hire right out of college. And I'm the founder of the company and a pretty seasoned CEO and entrepreneur before that. In what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can add an expectation onto the founder and then turn to him and say, when will you have that done for me by? Right? I think that's really, really cool. And it's because it's not about the status and the egos. There's no hierarchy in that sense there at all. It's about her role, casting agent, needing a communication from my role, spokesperson, and having a process to evolve our design of our system to define that communication pathway as needed. Right? And when you do it that way from the real work, she really noticed this from really working together. We didn't think to design that one up front. We wouldn't have thought to design that one up front. But it came up from just doing the work together and having a pathway where we could evolve the different communication pathways, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'd say you need here. It's not that you need to figure out all this stuff up front. What you need is a meta framework so that when somebody notices they're not getting a communication, or when you notice people are coming to you and you don't want them coming to you. This is what I often find when I talk to former managers who go into this system. People keep coming to them. And the manager now has the opportunity to push that back and say, well, wait a minute, why are you coming to me? And how do we design that out of the system? Why do I feel the need to be a heroic firefighter and jump in and solve something here? Instead, what expectations do I put on others so I'm no longer needed, so that my management function is obsolete, right? Which is what we want a good manager to do even in a management hierarchy, make themselves obsolete, but most don't do it. They just get stuck in this loop of firefighting forever. And that's often because they don't have the meta framework or the language to evolve the expectation structure, which at its core is really what Holacracy gives you. It defines a structured language for designing an organization. It's almost like a programming language, custom designed for describing an organizational system. And then it gives you a framework for evolving that design itself, right? So that anyone in the system can start proposing changes to this design language, pattern language for how we work together.
Yeah, awesome. That was a good example. Thank you. Never was. See, you jumped up here. Do you have a question for us, for Brian? Or a comment? Looks like we can't hear you, and I can see that you just tried turning mute off again. You could try typing it in the stage chat or leaving and coming back.
Yeah, or push to talk or something.
So we'll try the latter, leaving and coming back. Yeah, so that's really that's interesting that I'm getting a clear picture of like roles, and each person can have different roles, and roles interact with other roles. And so then you just need, through governance, you basically define the interactions between the roles. And you must not define every interaction, right? There's got to be some that can happen within the framework, but I guess it's expectations between them is what you can define through governance.
Yeah, so this is why the role of purpose. So every role has a purpose, which is a very high level, like what ultimately is this role trying to achieve? And what that lets you do is, instead of trying to define everything, you can start with just a purpose and say, use your judgment, go do whatever makes sense to you for that purpose. And then let the explicit definition of the specific expectations or constraints be tension driven. In other words,
Yeah.
if there's no tension and everyone's just going and doing their purpose, you don't need to waste all your time defining all that clarity and structure. Like, it's just working. Just go do it. And then notice where something's not working and use that to drive the clarity. Right? So it's just in time clarification. It's not trying to define everything up front.
Yeah. So now I've got this idea too of, all right, so we have this engineering work stream. There's 13 of us. We used to have managers. Why do I even need to think if we need them now? Let's just wait till there's some kind of tension that then demands something be different. But while things are going, just let them go.
That's right. Yeah. And I think this in a nutshell is, I think I'll say the mistake a lot of people make. They focus on what's the right design for the system instead of going one level higher, more abstract, and saying, what's the right meta system that will let us change the design of the system over time in an evolutionary way? Right. And I think that is a much more powerful question. So instead of asking, what's the right design so I don't need managers, go up one layer. How do I put in place a meta framework to allow everyone to evolve the design of the system so that we can obsolete managers over time?
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Never was. Are you here with us now?
Yeah, I am. Sorry about that, guys. I had to jump out and jump back in to get it to work. So basically, I just want to say great points here. Exactly kind of in line with what I just proposed previously. If everyone has had a chance to read in the first or the second article, the first milestone, basically the purpose is to begin establishing direct lines that build channels of open communication between designated community groups. So this is basically exactly what I'm saying. This meta structure that is put in place for the health and well-being of the DAO, that is built to open these lines of communication between work streams, between the community itself, between the foundation, between all these different units that are trying to decentralize, autonomize, and organize the DAO itself. So this is exactly, I love this conversation. I apologize that I was not able to listen to the beginning part of it, but what I have heard so far, I mean, is just reinforcing exactly what I was putting in the thing. I know some people, haven't quite been able to look at it and were questioning, with all the overlap, why would it be necessary? The overlap is not that I'm stepping on people's toes or managers or trying to prevent them from doing their jobs. I'm trying to establish something that elevates everything to enable everything to work in a more effective and efficient manner, to where, like you said, eventually management is no longer like the focus. That role evolves into something more. And this is the whole point that I'm trying to draw out by proposing this. Obviously, I've had some time to start putting this together, but this is a very involved and very complex topic and task. So, I'm just like putting things down. I can't say that it's 100% complete, and I don't know how long it would take to be 100% complete. This is an evolving thing. That's why having a work stream that is there to maintain this, and push for this and develop to, drive this within the community, I feel is so important because it's pushing this whole topic of where does the DAO go? How does the DAO evolve? How does the DAO become stronger? And how does it ensure that members of all types are empowered and feel the ability that they can participate and bring as much as they can to the table versus, not being able to do so. I'll stop there and let them continue.
Yeah, I haven't. I know I saw the post about that yesterday, and I'm looking forward to reading it. Maybe I have a new eye to read it with after this conversation too. So super appreciate that you put it out there. And you mentioning that proposal makes me have another question for Brian, which is, when you talk about like the governance side of things, and Brian, you talked about you had the tension with this new college hire, the bookcaster, and it came in at a governance meeting. So how do you think about, Brian, how often governance meetings happen, and then also like how much time does someone spend in a holacracy empowered organization on governance and improving like governance and those kind of things versus getting work done?
Yeah, so the amount of time, it tends to be about 1%, right? Which it's interesting when people are new to it, there's often a fear that it's going to take so much, but which doesn't make any sense to me in that, if it's improving the operations and the way things work, the ROI on that is incredibly high. And the amount of time is not that significant, 1%, maybe 2% when you're new to it. For whatever reason, it's going to feel like more than that because it's a new process you're learning. So the brain space it takes up at first might be higher because it's new, right? You're learning how to use this new decision-making tool, right? And this new language for how to describe roles and all that. But the actual amount of time is fairly small. And what most teams find is when they're brand new to it, it tends to work better to, most of the meetings happen in meetings in real time, the governance does. Because you're new, you're learning, and ideally you've got a facilitator that's been trained, or even better, that's an experienced coach. It's a different process. It really helps to have somebody who knows what they're doing there to facilitate it. Yeah. As people learn it, then a lot of the governance goes to asynchronous processing. In fact, we make a software tool called GlassFrog. I showed a link to it earlier in the chat that structures this and kind of keeps the org chart, and it has an interface for governance that somebody can go in and build a proposal and then click a button and it either emails it or posts it to Slack or whatever and sends it out to everyone else. And if everyone else just clicks no objection, then the proposal is automatically adopted and changes the role structure. And then, of course, if somebody thinks it's worth more discussion, they can escalate it to a real-time meeting. But that way, we find that maybe 90% of the proposals in my company are all handled asynchronously outside of meetings. So the actual ones that go to meetings are only the ones that really need a little bit more in-depth integration work, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and it becomes very simple. Like I'll go about my normal workday and then I'll run into something where I realize I need a new expectation from another role, or I need a new boundary, a constraint on another role. And so I just whip out a proposal really quick, hit a button, and then it pushes out to Slack and everyone gets to see it and respond. And that might take me a few minutes in my workday to get a piece of clarity added to our role structure, right? It becomes smooth and second nature when you get used to it.
Do you ever, like, let's say in this exact example, I need this new expectation from this other role. Do you ever talk to whoever's filling that other role first and, hey, is this reasonable, blah, blah, blah? Or do you just, is it like the default, is it better to just go straight to governance and have an open conversation or where everybody sees it?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The instinct when people are new to this is often go to the person and kind of socialize it first.
Yeah.
In fact, we're used to doing that in most organizations, right? There's generally a norm in a lot of companies to, not surprise people with proposals and meetings, like go socialize things, get buy-in. And that's an incredibly bad habit from a holacracy frame.
Yeah.
Right? It's one of those things that it makes sense in a traditional organization why people do that. I'm not claiming it's a bad habit in a traditional company, but it is in a holacracy powered company. And what you're doing when you're doing that is basically bypassing the governance rules and process as the official authority system, and you're kind of making the official authority system more the consensus between two people. Is someone comfortable with it? Right? And it encourages the wrong question. When you go to somebody and ask, you're basically asking, are they on board with it?
Right.
And remember, we want to shift the frame to instead, the question in governance is, do you see any reasons why this proposal will get in your way of doing your work? Which is a different question than, do you like it? Are you on board with it? Do you agree with it? Right? So my encouragement is, don't do that. Just send the proposal over, and if they have a concern, they'll raise an objection, and then we'll integrate it. And that process, it's when people are new, they tend to think of objecting to someone's proposal as somehow antagonistic or conflict, and it's not. It's collaborative. It's building together. When you get used to this, it's I'll often encourage people to object, or I will sometimes raise an objection to my own proposal because the proposal would solve something, but it actually creates another problem. So I'm going to object to it and then get my team's help solving the objection. So it's a reframe from how we're used to thinking. And part of that is stop going to meetings to socialize things, stop going to other people to get buy-in, stop asking people if everyone agrees, and start leading your role, making autocratic decisions, taking empowered action in your role. And when you need something from someone else to be different, make a proposal in governance, right? And trust that they're going to represent their role, and they'll raise an objection if they have one, and you'll solve it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have been seeing that happen more as we act more and more like a decentralized organization. At least I have been making the meaning of, okay, no, it is okay to just put it out there, even if it has impact on people. All right, I'm not, because I was way one of those people who talked to everyone individually that would be impacted first, right, before I brought anything to a group. And I'm doing that less and less. And it's definitely like retraining a muscle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
yep, absolutely.
It's a great point to the need and the ask for the attempt to remove egos out of the situation and to distance yourself from feeling like you're being attacked personally versus trying to do something on more of a larger scale for the whole. And obviously a lot of people are very itchy about territory, and they're very protective over perceived notion of what's mine and what's yours. I mean, and I've gone to point out a couple times where when you bring into the words like salary and other things, it gives a type of ownership to something. I mean, yes, we're all owners in a sense, but at the same time, you can't have people that deciding that this is mine. A DAO is interchangeable, so therefore it may be your responsibility or task at this point in time, but that may change as things change within the DAO or objectives or other things like that. So I definitely would add to the caution of people saying ego tripping or thinking that this is my domain, therefore nobody can tread on it or else it becomes a problem. I'm not saying that it's happened here as of yet, but it's a cautionary tale to any organization that's trying to run more in a decentralized way versus a centralized way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, really, that's one of the key problems that Holacracy is trying to solve for. And I'm not claiming it's perfect by any means. You can still have egos running over things, but I think it's a lot harder for an ego to run over things in a Holacracy powered company than in either a traditional management hierarchy or a purely decentralized system that actually invites people to represent their own ego, their own interests. Right? Holacracy has a lot of mechanisms that are intentionally designed to pull people's focus back to the purpose of the team and the roles, and not just their own ego stuff. And that's designed almost in the governance process, those 4 questions I mentioned, part of their purpose is to kind of hold up a mirror to it if somebody is just stuck in their own ego reaction to a proposal and it's not a practical concern that really does need to get addressed. So it's really magical what happens when you put in that process, and kind of gives everyone a gravitational force pulling people out of the ego perspectives.
Well, I see that we're at the top of the hour, actually just 1 minute over by my clock. So I think let's be respectful of the time here and for your time too, Brian. Really appreciate you joining us today was really, really interesting for me, and I've heard from some others for them too. So, yeah, just do you have any? I guess I think you posted in the stage chat, but like if someone's interested in following up with you or someone at Holacracy One, what's the path?
Yeah, best bet. So one, just for more information, check out our website, holacracy.org. Heads up that people misspell holacracy all the time. It's HOLA, not HOLO.
Yeah.
And on our website, you'll see a contact us button. If you click that, we will get your message to the right role to respond. I promise we're pretty good at that. So you can just go in there and contact us, and we'll get your message to the right place.
Cool. All right. Well, hey, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks again, Brian, for joining us. And hope everyone has a good day. For lots of people, I hope to see you at the governance call at 3:00.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate connecting with the community here, and good luck with everything you guys are doing. I'm really inspired by it.
Yeah, this was
Thank you.
fascinating. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Bye.
And to close this, I'm just left instead.